Hello, everyone. Welcome. Excited to see all of our attendees. Looks like from all across the country rolling in. Thank you all for coming. We're going to give folks a few minutes to get here, get settled, and we'll get started here in a moment with the Avarna Group and our doubling down on DEI. I would love if everybody who has joined so far could drop in the chat where they're coming from, what location, what part of the US or outside of the US they are coming from, and what company they're with, just to kind of see who we've got on the call today. We're excited to have you here. I see some familiar names, not just People for Bike staff, but some really great volunteers in the industry. Thank you for joining. Hi, Doreen. Good to hear from you. Good to see you. Keith, Andrew. So great to have you here. I see a couple folks from Outride. Welcome. Awesome. And as folks continue to join, I'm going to cover a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording this webinar and it will be available after the session is complete. We typically share things within a week, so we're excited to be able to get this to all of you and anybody who couldn't attend today in person. We will have time for a live Q&A at the end. Please submit your questions in the Q&A tab. I know it feels natural to drop it in the chat, but the Q&A tab is a little bit more organized and a little bit easier for our panelists to manage and get to all of the questions. Welcome, welcome. All right, it is 12:02. I'm going to get us rolling. Thank you to our People for Bikes Coalition members. My name is Jordan Trout, and I am the Director of Marketing here at People for Bikes, and I am really excited to get to be your cruise director on this webinar today. Truly thank you to our trade association members and all of our subcommittee folks for joining and for being a part of this work. People for Bikes is 320 member companies working to make biking better for everyone. And this is part of our virtual education series, which is part of our trade association member benefits. As a dues paying People for Bikes member, you get access to all of these educational options, like these DEI webinars and more. You also get consumer insights. You get discounts on the Bicycle Owners Manual. We work on trade, tariff, and supply chain issues. And we're really here to help you be the best at what all of you do, which is building and designing and selling great bikes. Today, we're really excited to welcome the founding partners of the Avarna Group, Aparna Rajagopal and Ava Holiday. They have been working and leading in this space for a number of years, and we are really excited to take a few hours of their time and learn more about everything that they're working on. They're working towards building a world where people are connected to ourselves and one another and the planet. And they work in the environmental and outdoor spaces to support leaders to implement strategies to make sure that companies are equitable, diverse, inclusive, and justice focused in their work. And I am really excited to welcome to the digital stage Aparna and Ava. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Jordan, and thanks, People for Bikes. It's always a pleasure to do these webinars. I will introduce myself. I'm Aparna. I use she, hers pronouns. I'm calling you from the homelands of the Kalapuya people. I live in Eugene, Oregon. And I am one of the founding partners of the Avarna Group, along with Ava. We have been doing DEI, DEIB, DEIJ, whatever JEDI acronym you want to use. We've been doing this work for 9 years in the outdoor and environmental space as a company. And then prior to that, for several years on our own or in-house. I worked in-house in outdoor education, leading diversity and inclusion efforts at the time. And I've had the pleasure of working with People for Bikes for several years, since 2021. And it really started with supporting the DEI subcommittee in a number of different ways, and then also hosted or co-hosted 3 industry webinars in 2023 with various members of the DEI subcommittee. So if you didn't attend those webinars, you can find them on the YouTube channel for People for Bikes. But there was one on unconscious bias in the bike industry and power dynamics. There was one on doing our personal work, and that one talked about negative messages that we internalize about our own communities and also how to engage in allyship. And then there was another one on inclusive and equitable marketing and communications. I will hand it off to Ava to introduce herself and then give you all some framing for the day.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ava. I use she, hers pronouns. I'm calling you all from the homelands of the Bitterroot Salish people, which is also known as Missoula, Montana. Been working with Avarna for 9 years on all of the work that she just described. And prior to that, really came into this work through some graduate work through the lens of cultural anthropology. And I will leave it at that because we have a lot to get through. So Avarna, I'll let you do the framing and then I will kick us off.
Great. So a little bit of framing today is that, let me just go through our quick goals. So our goals for today are, for this hour, is that hopefully you all leave with a better understanding of why it's important to continue to prioritize DEI in the bike industry, that you all understand the nature of the backlash against DEI efforts, the most recent, at least, iteration of it, how it's not the first of its kind, where it's coming from, and what it means for the bike industry in particular. And that you all leave with some strategies to help you navigate this sort of tricky political and legal landscape of DEI moving forward. So those are our goals. And the way we're going to do it is, we're going to spend, Ava's going to spend a little bit of time kind of going over like why is DEI important, and then understanding the nature of this backlash. And when we say backlash, really what we're talking about is over the last year, we've witnessed a mounting backlash against DEI in the wake of last summer, almost a year ago, maybe a little over a year ago, a Supreme Court decision that struck down college affirmative action policies. And since then, we've been keeping really close track of what's been happening around the country, both in legislatures as well as in courts. And we've been working with our clients in navigating this backlash and wanted to share some of our learnings with you. So Ava's going to talk a little bit about the backlash, what it means, some of the common themes that we're seeing in it, kind of what are the efforts that the backlash is really targeting. And then I will talk about some strategies to navigate the backlash. And then we will have hopefully around 10 minutes for Q&A afterward. So that is our agenda. But before we dive in, before I hand it off to Ava, I want to be really clear about our intentions, because we're always on the fence on whether to talk about this topic, because we don't want to contribute to the panic or the chilling effects of DEI work. I know a lot of organizations and companies are feeling a little bit worried about their DEI efforts. Ultimately, we're choosing to present this webinar, and we're actually writing a larger article about this because we think it's really important for all of us to stay informed about what's happening, and also to have, some tools. So giving those of you in the bike sector who are committed to DEI with tools to be able to navigate that landscape. So that's our reasoning. And one last disclaimer is that I used to be a lawyer. That was in a previous career, but and so I've been like really nerding out on the legal aspect of this, kind of checking out different court opinions and legislation. That said, this is not legal advice. I am not currently a practicing lawyer anywhere. And so nothing that we're presenting today is intended to be legal advice. And if you're curious about legal implications, we would advise that you talk to your lawyers. And with that said, I will hand it off to Ava to get us started.
All right, so I'm going to talk really briefly about the why. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly because often if people are in these webinars, you're already kind of bought in. But wanted to make the point that, we've worked in the outdoor space for a really long time, and there is something unique about cycling in that there is a recreational component to it. And there's also a component to biking that provides mobility and access, provides human-powered active transportation, can provide people with just a sense of autonomy and empowerment, and also helps foster community. I think all outdoor activity can foster community, but the rest are a little bit more unique to cycling or biking. So wanted to share a little bit more about why we think DEI is important to your sector in particular. So there's a lot of different types of folks on people who have different jobs, people who are have different touch points with the biking industry. So like, for example, if you're in product development, the innovation piece might be really compelling to you, that knowing that DEI drives innovation. There's a lot of research that shows a diversity in your employee base and an inclusive work environment helps drive that. You might be in sales and you've maybe heard about how DEI can help your company or organization stay more relevant in the face of shifting demographics, and you're able to just tap into a broader market base. That can be really compelling. If you're a person who works in HR or people and culture, just knowing that an inclusive work environment helps staff retention and engagement and just allows people to show up as their best selves at work can be a compelling reason. If you are working in a nonprofit, maybe you see the power of bikes for building inclusive communities and increasing that access to transportation or to the outdoors. Again, maybe you're a community organization, nonprofit, you may have seen data showing that their Black and Brown communities are much more vulnerable to being policed on bikes, having higher fatality rates. And to address that, we have to engage in DEI work. We have to engage in that addressing those structural inequities. Or maybe you're working in urban infrastructure and you've seen how histories of redlining directly correlate to a lack of bike infrastructure for communities of color, and you understand that DEI is a component of addressing that history. Or maybe you're an athlete or an ambassador and you know that a more diverse ridership helps inspire more people to ride. So those are just some reasons why we think DEI continues to be really important, depending on where you are in the industry and your touch point. Again, we don't want to spend too much time on this because we want to get more into understanding what this backlash is all about. So I'm going to give you all a little bit of a background on this backlash. This is by no means the first backlash against DEI work. It is just one version of century-long oppression to social justice movements. In recent history, so in the last like 10-ish years, the anti-DEI movement has really attacked education on racism and histories of enslavement in public schools, what library books are available. They've attacked gender-affirming healthcare, trans-inclusive bathroom policies, trans inclusion in healthcare in general, and sports, reproductive rights, and anti-racism training in government agencies. As Aparna mentioned, the current backlash that we're experiencing over the last year was really punctuated by that Supreme Court case, which is Students for Fair Admissions versus Presidents and Fellows of Harvard College. And in that decision, it banned Harvard University and University of North Carolina's affirmative action college admissions policies. We're going to just refer to this as the SFFA case or decision for shorthand. I will say saying SFFA is also kind of a mouthful, so I might just call it the decision at times. So this decision sparked a lot of financial, social, and legal momentum for powerful far-right political action groups and individuals. You might hear the names Edward Blum, who is the founder of SFFA, Pacific Legal Foundation, Federalist Society. So this decision has sort of kicked off further bankrolling of lawsuits and advocacy against DEI policies in courts and legislatures across the country. So this is all to say, what we're seeing today is not new, but it is an evolution, a new evolution or new tactics to fight against DEI efforts. And that's why we wanted to sort of share some of the specifics today, so you're well equipped to understand what's going on, and then you feel more empowered to respond to it. So I'm going to share a little bit about what has actually been happening. And this is mostly at a state level. So some of the targets of the backlash are DEI training. This has been under attack since 2020 when Trump issued a memo prohibiting the teaching of critical race theory in government agencies. And since then, state legislatures have basically taken that as a cue to pass laws prohibiting public colleges and universities, as well as state governments from requiring that training. We've also seen attacks on DEI offices and staff. So again, some state legislatures have passed laws prohibiting colleges, universities, and governments from having dedicated DEI offices, departments, or staff. We've also seen attacks against diversity hiring targets. So we have seen state legislatures pass laws prohibiting race-based preferences in public colleges and university admissions, and then also in those university and government hiring practices. And then I will also say courts have been hearing cases by white job candidates and employees who are claiming reverse discrimination in hiring and promotion policies. The next piece is around DEI statements. So again, this happened at the state legislator level, and prohibiting colleges, universities, government agencies from issuing public statements about DEI commitments. Then there's also procurement practices. Courts are striking down business agencies like the Small Business Association from requiring that a certain percentage of contracts be set aside for minority-owned businesses. And then there's a couple of pieces around funding and scholarships. So lawsuits are being filed, attacking funding programs and scholarships that are meant to benefit Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. And these lawsuits have targeted not only public entities like governments and schools like I've been talking about, but also private companies and funders. Along a similar line, internships and fellowships have been, there have been filings attacking fellowships that are designed to build bridges for folks of color to work in particular fields. And then the last thing that I'll share is that there's been a longer ongoing attack on trans-inclusive policies. So this predates the current backlash that was kicked off by that Supreme Court decision. But state legislators across the country continue to introduce bills to seek to block trans people from receiving healthcare, education, legal recognition, and participation in sports. It's particularly prevalent where I live here in Montana. So that's sort of the landscape of the current attacks. The last thing that I wanted to share with you all before I hand it off to Aparna is trying to make sense of like, what's really behind this? Like, what are some of the mental gymnastics that folks have had to do to get to this place where they're justifying the backlash? So we kind of call this through lines in the backlash. There's a lot of different absurd and nonsensical arguments that we've heard. But one observation that Aparna and I have seen is that at the core of this backlash is fear. Could be fear of losing relevance, fear of being treated by the same way that marginalized communities have been treated for so long, fear of losing that status, fear of losing material goods and resources, and so much more. So to me, when I read a lot of these justifications for this backlash, it is really rooted in fear. And that is so different from social justice movements, which are based on moving towards liberty for everyone. So there's a real difference there for me. And then I'll also say that one additional thing is that fear begets fear. Not only is the DEI backlash coming from a place of fear, but the messages continue to stoke fear and it just sort of builds upon itself. So that has been one sort of organizing principle that I've noticed throughout all of this that has been really helpful for me just to understand the sort of what's going on. Wanted to give you all a couple of ways in which this fear actually more specifically showed up. And the first one is what we call cherry picking. So meaning focusing on some really specific thing without having like a principled stance that is guided by overarching consistent values other than fear. So for example, when we're talking about affirmative action, a lot of the arguments has been like, oh, this is not in line with meritocracy, but nothing has been said about legacy admissions or nepotism. So there's this like cherry picking of like what they're going to talk about. We also see a lot of like picking fights to stoke fear and outrage. So one thing that really sticks out to me is this past spring on Trans Day of Visibility, which has been in existence since 2009, happened to fall on Easter Sunday this year, and the right decided to pick a fight to stoke further outrage by claiming this was an attack on Christianity, which, as a side note, fully ignores the fact that trans people can also be Christian. The next one is co-option. So we notice that critics of DEI often will use DEI terminology and concepts in their own arguments, often incorrectly, and it creates this muddled definition of the word, creates more confusion. And in that confusion, you can, is where sort of like outrage and fear can grow. So for example, they'll say like race conscious hiring policies discriminate against white people. And in addition, they'll claim that they're psychologically unsafe in DEI trainings without a willingness to understand or acknowledge the intention behind things like race conscious hiring policies, or the difference between being a little bit uncomfortable in a workshop versus being harassed daily and fearing for your safety on a daily basis. The next one I want to talk about is ignoring history or context. There is often a flat out refusal to acknowledge the longstanding and ongoing impacts of centuries of oppression. So often right-wing arguments assume that each person is born with that same opportunity, despite there being mountains of research, data, stories, experience that demonstrate otherwise. So for example, often we'll hear that racism just isn't an issue anymore because we had a Black president, or that history is in the past and we need to focus on the future. The second to last one that I want to talk about is we often hear that individuals get blamed rather than understanding the systems. So refusing to acknowledge that there are systems of oppression, systems that have set people up to be disadvantaged, and refusing to acknowledge that shifts the blame over to individuals. And that often paints the individuals as lazy or unintelligent or something else that is really just gross and unfair. And then the last one is intentional misinformation. This is often, again, to like stoke that outrage and fear. And we have a couple of examples here from headlines. This often shows up in headlines. So this one says, professor says he was haunted by critical race theory training that allegedly claimed white teachers are a problem. There's another one, critical race theory is the new segregation across schools nationwide. Is Harley-Davidson woke? Here's why some conservative activists are angry. And then the most recent sort of kind of, what do we even call this? An X outrage, Twitter outrage, inflammatory and false rhetoric on social media made about gold medalist Olympic boxer Imani Khalif. So those are some of the themes that we often see in the backlash. Sometimes it's nice to be able to organize some of the arguments in their head while also understanding that like it is always, almost always in service of creating fear and outrage in folks. So with that said, I'm going to hand it off to Aparna, who's going to provide some more practical ideas about how to navigate the backlash.
Thanks, Ava. Yeah, so I want to talk about, so now that we know a little bit more about where this backlash is coming from, what the targets are, and what these sort of through lines are in these faulty arguments that are being made, I wanted to, share with you some of what we've learned about how you can navigate this backlash. And so the first thing I'll say is that it's really important when you're thinking about your DEI efforts to stay intersectional. What do I mean by that? So the intersectionality is a term or concept coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw to describe the impacts on a person who holds more than one marginalized identity. So that's what this little image on the left here is meant to demonstrate. So for example, Black women experience systemic disadvantages based on both their race as well as their gender, or a queer young person raised in a working class family is going to experience those systemic disadvantages or marginalization based on their sexual orientation and their age and their class. So that is a little bit of what intersectionality means. What we've noticed is that the backlash currently targets very specific identities, right? So policies that might be like very specifically around race or around gender identity. But if your DEI work continues to address multiple identities at once, chances are that it will be more insulated from some of these very race-specific and gender-specific backlash tactics. So for example, if you have an initiative for women, like just being really clear that your initiative is designed to address barriers that all women, in particularly women of color, disabled women, older women, trans women, and more experience, you're continuing to talk about all these identities. Another strategy, this is a very specific framework that we've learned about in the last few years called targeted universalism. So targeted universalism is a concept that was coined by Dr. John A. Powell. He heads up the Center for Othering and Belonging, and he describes targeted universalism as a platform to operationalize programs that move all groups toward a universal policy goal, as well as a way of communicating and publicly marketing such programs in an inclusive, bridging manner. So really what he's really introducing here is a framework that really helps describe how DEI ultimately helps everyone. And the use of this framework really helps quell some of the current backlash. So let me go through what this framework is about. So these two words in this are targeted and universalism. So let me just start by saying, like, what is universal policy? A universal policy are things like Social Security or the federal minimum wage, like all these programs that benefit, provide the same or very similar benefits to everyone who's eligible. And of course, they could be helpful policies, but they don't really address very persistent and systemic inequities. So what John A. Powell notices is that these policies are not actually always neutral, and they sometimes can exacerbate inequities and funnel really important resources away from those who need it most, and to those who potentially don't even need it at all in the name of this idea of universality. And I have this image here because often I think about this idea of like, oh, rising tide floats all boats, which is like nice in theory, but the reality is that is like a universal sort of idea, right? And then there's targeted, which is the other end. So targeted policies are things like SNAP benefits. That's an income-based program that a lot of states have. The Americans with Disabilities Act, right, specifically for people with disabilities, and affirmative action, which historically has been focused on, historically disadvantaged groups, especially around race. So targeted policies are designed to address inequities. And these are the types of policies that we've noticed are more vulnerable to attacks in the current political and legal landscape. So then what's targeted universalism? What targeted universalism is about, and this is John A. Powell here, is about you set universal goals. So universal goals can be like bike access for all, and then or safe streets. And then you have targeted approach. And so, for example, more bikes in low-income neighborhoods or better bike lanes in red line neighborhoods. So targeted universalism, sorry, I can't say it very fast, is really similar to needs-based programs or race-conscious programs. I'm going to tell you what race-conscious means in a second. They set a baseline for what everyone should have access to, like that universal goal. And then they assess who already has access and who's still struggling, and then gets to work like designing a program to ensure everyone can have access. So that is what this is about. If you're curious, the last slide in the slide deck has a link to the website for targeted universalism and some resources, and we'll share this slide deck with People for Bikes to share with all of you. So we keep talking about race conscious policies. So I do want to talk about the strategy of adopting race conscious policies, which is an example of targeted universalism. So there is a difference between race-based policies, and which are policies that name race as a primary or potentially the only criteria for decision making, whereas race conscious, which considers the impacts of racism to level the playing field. So one is looking at just race as an identity, and one is looking at the impacts of racism as a system of oppression. And so, for example, some race conscious actions are, affinity groups, employee resources groups. Those are race conscious. Equitable hiring, evaluation, promotion, and pay policies, again, are race conscious. They are considering the impacts of racism. We have a couple of very specific examples of programs. They're not in the bike space, but just to sort of build some context, there's a grant program that funds household solar and battery storage projects. that addresses historical racial disparities in access to solar by giving priority to projects in really specific geographic areas. And the way they determine priorities, they're looking at redlining, they're looking at energy burden and income and asthma rates, right? Those are all impacts of racism, but they're not just looking at like, where are people of color living, because that would just be race-based. So there are all these other sort of impacts that can serve as proxies for thinking about race. And then this program also does outreach about grant fund target, which targets community organizations and households in that area. There's another example in LA County, which is an ARPA fund program where the county has set a goal of allocating 75% of the American Rescue Plan Act funds, our ARPA funds, to 40% of the neighborhoods that are most impacted by the pandemic and longstanding inequities. So again, impacted by the pandemic, impacted by inequity. And chances are those neighborhoods are also going to be mostly Black and brown neighborhoods, but we're really not looking at just race, we're looking at impacts of racism. This image here on the right is just meant to show the impacts of racism on mental health. And again, looking at the researched impacts of racism can really help inform your policies. So I want to talk more about data, because data, what we've noticed is that when there's data to show inequities, policies are kind of held up. They're not, that they're less vulnerable to attack. In fact, courts have said, if you can show the direct inequities that you're trying to address with this thing, then it's fine. There's a reasonable basis to have this policy. So you have to have data to implement race-conscious policies. And fortunately, there are many people and organizations who've been documenting data about impacts of racism on communities of color. And so it can be pretty easy for you all in the bike sector to create race-conscious or generally identity-conscious policies if you're thinking about gender identity and some of the other identities. In fact, last year, I found an article that former PeopleForBikes employee Kieran Herbert wrote on behalf of the Better Bike Share Partnership on using data to advocate for equitable infrastructure, which I've hyperlinked on the last page of the slide deck, but it's just a really great article to explain why data is really important. I also want to share some data, actual data that we found that could help you all. And so the first thing is the Trust for Public Lands released a report in 2020 that revealed that across the nation, parks that are in majority white neighborhoods are, majority non-white neighborhoods are half as large and serve nearly 5 times more people than parks in majority white neighborhoods. So what this little infographic and the study is showing is that there is a lack of access to parks and green spaces in neighborhoods of color. You can also look at actual redlining studies. This is just one example of the health effects of redlining in particular neighborhoods. And redlining maps can really help show how that redlining has resulted in a disinvestment in bike infrastructure and health disparities and lack of access to transportation and all these other things in so many different places. So this map is just one example. There are a lot of other resources for you all to potentially use to build these identity conscious policies. So here is a single slide that has a whole bunch, and each of these is hyperlinked here when you get the slide deck. So there was a discrimination report card, which found that race and gender biases in hiring persist. It's not bikes industry specific, but it shows that there are still unconscious biases in hiring processes. So it's important to create race and gender conscious hiring practices. A few years ago, Pink Bike issued a report showing that just 1.4% of women cyclists earn over $100,000 per year, which is 10 times less than the amount that men earn, which can be used to create, again, gender conscious compensation policies. And then Bicycling Magazine did a study of police data. And I think Ava mentioned this earlier, but this data shows that Black cyclists are stopped up to 3 times more often than a white cyclist, which can be, again, you can use that to create policies around police reform or safety for Black cyclists. Similarly, a 2022 study by researchers at Boston and Harvard found Black cyclists are more than 4 times more likely to die while riding a bike than white cyclists on a per mile basis. Again, that can be used to guide safety investments in predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods. And then the last study I'll share, and there are so many more studies, but I just wanted to share these to show like data exists, right? So Dangerous by Design did a pedestrian fatality study that found that Black and Native Americans, older adults, and people walking in low-income communities die at higher rates and face higher levels of risk compared to all Americans. Again, this can be used to spur greater investment in public safety in these particular communities. So this is just examples of some data, and I would just urge you all to continue to like find that data, whether it doesn't need to be specific to the bike industry, and you can even gather that data within your own organization to be able to better justify and rationalize your race conscious or identity conscious policies. So another strategy I want to talk about is around lived experiences. So this is a quote from that SFFA decision, right, Ava? It's really hard to say. I might just say Harvard decision. So in its decision, the Supreme Court was very explicit in saying that universities can still consider a college applicant's lived experience as a person of color. And what they say is you can still consider their race because how race affected his or her life, be it through discrimination, inspiration, or otherwise, could indicate courage and determination or that student's unique ability to contribute to the university. So what this means is that if you're thinking about fellowship programs or internship programs or even recruitment and hiring and funding and scholarships, rather than sort of focusing explicitly on people of color, being able to articulate your why and saying the reason we're doing this is we this particular lived experience as a person of color or lived experience as a woman or lived experience as a trans person adds and contributes in these particular ways. I want to continue to talk about hiring because I think that though some of the targets of the backlash are sort of race diversity hiring targets, one thing that's really important to do is to continue to address hiring bias. Rather than naming specific numerical diversity targets in hiring, you can still continue to cast a wide net and implement strategies to minimize hiring bias. So those strategies can be around like marking out names in your screening process or marking out the schools that people went to, or even in the outdoor industry, we notice that there is a bias in favor of hiring people who have worked at larger, more like heritage brands. And so marking that out in resumes during screening can help you mitigate bias. There is also a strategy around making sure you have a multi-person hiring committee and a hiring rubric and so much more. This slide at the bottom, we've hyperlinked our toolkit on mitigating bias on recruitment and hiring, and there are other resources out there as well. And this is because, and I mentioned this earlier in that slide, right, two slides before this on data, that there's a really recent study, a discrimination report card that I think was created by researchers at Columbia, which finds that racial and gender biases in hiring continue to persist. So, right, you have the data, you have the inequities demonstrated, you can still do all of that work to mitigate bias in hiring. This is a really simple slide, but I will say that for us at the Avarna Group, we're always talking about equity and justice as the most important parts of this work. The Supreme Court held that racial diversity in a student body was not a compelling state interest to justify affirmative action admission policies. But I've been kind of monitoring what different courts are saying, and even a really conservative court in Texas said that remedying past discrimination is a valid reason to engage in DEI work. So what does that mean? That means equity is a reasonable reason to do this work, and that equity is the work. We always say equity is the work and diversity is just one possible outcome. So that's what's on this slide. Diversity is what we are. It's the differences between us. It is one, if your company is more, or organization is more diverse, if the bike sector is more diverse, it is one indicator that we're doing something right, but that's not the work. The work is equity. The work is also inclusion. It's about creating cultures of belonging. And all of that requires dismantling barriers that some communities have experienced in both accessing the bike space and having inclusive experiences in the bike space, whether that's as an employee or whether that's as a customer. A couple of more strategies here. I want to talk about getting a little creative, exploring alternative language. So this moment calls on us to be both creative and intentional in our use of DEI. I think DEI as a shorthand is like helpful and useful, but it means so many different things. And because that acronym DEI is currently kind of the target for this work, it can be really helpful to think about what is other language that is actually more precise and can also at the same time insulate us from these frivolous lawsuits and nonsensical legislation. Because we say ambiguity does a disservice to us all. Let's just be more precise about it, and that's going to help us anyway. So fairness, it's a simple word, and it really connotes efforts to address historic power imbalances that have harmed some communities. You can use belonging. I mentioned this earlier, and belonging really is around all of your efforts to foster inclusive and welcoming spaces for your internal community of employees and volunteers and board members, as well as the external constituency you all have or the customer base. Collaboration or bridging can both be used to describe all the different efforts that are still DEI work, but efforts to build bridges with diverse groups along values divides and political affiliation. So this bridging work, I use bridging a lot to really talk about how do we bring all these different people along who have very different lived experiences and perspectives, and potentially even political affiliations. Community-centered work. That's really around your efforts to engage more diverse communities and center their needs and voices in your programs or in your marketing or product design. Again, all of this is DEI, but it is more precise about what you're actually doing. And at the same time, because you're not using a shorthand of DEI to refer to it, you're less likely to be in the crosshairs of some of these folks that are attacking DEI. I think this is the second to last strategy I want to talk about. It's also about continuing to be precise and creative. We can be really proactive with all the DEI trainings we do, rather than just calling them DEI training, which I actually think does a disservice because DEI again means so many things. You can describe the specific topic of your training and aim for that intersectional approach that is considering multiple identities beyond just race. And this goes back to former President Trump's, it was presidential memorandum that said, oh, you can't have any kind of critical race theory training in governments. And so that was very specifically about race. And then that's sort of since then morphed around state legislatures to be DEI trainings. So how can we be creative? It's not that we should no longer do anti-racism trainings, because it's really important to do that. But think about what you want your participants to leave those trainings with. For example, this is just these are screenshots of some of the workshops that we have at the Avarna Group. And you notice here, DEI is not in the title of any of these. There's grappling with unconscious bias, reckoning with histories of place and people. That one's really about looking at sort of the intersecting histories of the outdoor movement. There's even a bike specific one, and then marginalized communities in the US and how that has shaped the way that we are doing our work today. There's navigating difficult conversations. There's transforming from exclusion to belonging, which really looks at culture. There are other ones that are not on the slide. We have one on like building culturally relevant, responsible, revitalizing, and responsive curriculum and programming. So that's really around how to build programming that reaches everyone and mitigates bias. So, and then we have one on effective and equitable community engagement, going back to that community engagement piece. So all these titles, all these trainings, for us, we designed these titles to be really specific so that we don't like run into the sort of ambiguity of the general DEI title. And I think in being specific, the secondary benefit is that, again, you can potentially insulate yourself from some of the sort of anti-DEI training type legislation and lawsuits. Okay. This is the last couple of slides. I want to talk about the sort of one right way approach. And it's really important to avoid the sort of one right way to do DEI work. One reason that we believe DEI has been thrust into the national spotlight is because of the way that we've been doing DEI work. A recent Fortune magazine article reported that in pushing really hard for change over the past few years, DEI practitioners, so that's like us, consultants, potentially even in-house folks, haven't always left room for conversations, questions, or nuance, and have instead adopted the role of moral authority, positioning anyone who doesn't agree with our perspective and perhaps simply doesn't understand it as not just wrong, but bad. So what does that quote mean? I think that we have seen this tendency in both like the DEI practitioner world and people implementing DEI to really be on like this vigilant search for mistakes, like trying to figure out have this like high scrutiny lens of like, when is someone going to mess up? Or when is an organization going to do this wrong? We have in our minds that there is only one right way to do this work. And as a result, if people are doing it the wrong way or don't understand it, that we end up separating folks into good and bad people, like folks who are, there's an article by Joni Mayer that talks about how in sort of white allyship spaces, there's a tendency of like folks to separate themselves or kind of set themselves apart because they feel like they're more woke and more progressive and that they're not as hip to the DEI stuff, like not as progressive folks are like bad. So then good and bad, which doesn't help anyone because you're not rooting for each other to succeed. And in fact, you end up being competitive. That's another thing we're seeing. We're in competition with each other. And then finally, we lack compassion. Actually, this is not finally. We lack compassion. And what I mean by that is like, this stuff generates a lot of big feelings. And it's okay for people to have feelings, regardless of their identities. But we don't have any patience for feelings. I'm not saying that we need to like hold space. Like I, as a person of color, needs to like help a white person go through all the big feelings that they're going through and confronting, whatever the histories of their family or white privilege or whatever. What I'm saying is that person should be allowed to feel. And they need a space in which they're given that permission to feel without folks saying like, oh, I don't have time for, your tears or whatever. So we lack compassion in this work. We are not giving each other the grace that we want when we're learning something new. And as a result, and the last thing on this slide is we use cancel and call outs to shame rather than hold people accountable. So accountability is really important, yes. But there are so many ways to hold people in organizations accountable. And this idea of call outs were originally a way to hold people in power accountable when there was no other way to do it. Instead, what's happening now, and this is mostly in social media, we see that folks are just publicly shamed and just like taken down for maybe a small thing that they did that was wrong. There was a story that came out of a MS Society firing a 90-year-old volunteer because they didn't understand the reason why pronouns were being used in email signatures. And they just didn't understand. And as a result, they were fired. So this idea of weaponizing shame is not effective. It serves only to divide us. And I think it exposes DEI work to some of those critiques that have been made today. So instead of this sort of one right way approach, and I'll end with this, is it's really important to acknowledge that there is no approach is perfect, right? Perfection, to throw that out the door. We're never going to be perfect. We need a whole bunch of different approaches to do DEI work. We need folks to be organizing. We need legal advocacy, political advocacy, that interpersonal work, your own like individual work and more to do this. And that we really need each other to succeed. We don't want to tear each other down because we think, you know, like someone's not as woke as we are. We want to root for each other to succeed if we're really truly going to make this industry more inclusive and equitable for everyone. So those are all the strategies. I want to end with this before we flip to questions. We know you all are coming from a whole bunch of different places, I noticed in the chat, and a whole bunch of different types of organizations. I see some for-profits, some nonprofits, some government agency folks. And so the impacts of this backlash are going to be really different on each of you, depending on the type of organization you're in and where you are right now. So in Oregon, where I live, the state is still okay. They're like the certification office for business and inclusion and diversity is still administering its programs that require certain percentages of large contracts go to minority and women-owned businesses. And I'm a minority and women-owned business. We are. And so we're thankful for that in Oregon so far, those sort of procurement policies are not being targeted. However, if your organization or business is in the South or in the Southeast, you might want to just be a little bit more watchful of what's happening in courts and legislatures. So I have some resources here. This slide has a whole bunch of legislation trackers that you can use to sort of see what's happening around the country. These are just some examples. And then there's a whole bunch of other resources on this last page. I will just say that a lot of these legislation trackers are looking at they're looking at legislation. They're not looking at court decisions as much, but we are working with a whole bunch of other folks to continue to look at case law around the country. All right, 2 minutes over, but I am done. And I'm going to stop sharing my slide. I will, here's our information if you want to reach out to us for anything. We'll share the slide deck with you. And I will hand it off well, let me just do some Q&A. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Ava, have you been looking at some of the questions?
Yeah, there's 3 questions in there. There's one question that I think will be pretty quick to answer, which is where does affirmative action fit into race-based or race-conscious policy? And I'll just say it is a race-based policy because it is specifically naming race as the component of someone's identity that is being considered. Aparna, would you?
Yeah, I will.
You're the lawyer here.
I will qualify that with affirmative action looks a little bit different in different places, but there's, I think it's called the Texas 10% policy that guarantees a college education to the top 10% of graduates across high schools in Texas. And that has been a really effective way of bringing in, because they're looking at all schools, regardless of how many resources the school has. And usually, and so in doing that, they're actually able to bring in a lot more people of color or support college for a lot more people of color and folks from low income households. So there have been sort of like creative ways to do affirmative action adjacent work that are happening around the country, but like affirmative action, like as in like X% of people of color need to be admitted, that is race-based.
Great. Now I'm going to go in order because there's some meatier questions that folks are asking. So the first one is that it strikes me that the backlash has been systemic and implemented through legislative actions, but the response is often taken up in a decentralized way by rank and file employees. How do you talk about the responses? Can you talk about how the responses can be more systemic and not the sole responsibility of ad hoc DEI committees, ERGs, and people who choose to come to spaces like these? This is a very meaty question, and I will say that I have 2 overarching thoughts. One is that if you're not in an advocacy space, if you are not in state legislatures, your sphere of influence may be different than people who have been doing coordinated legislative action, both and from all different perspectives. So I want to just note that like you may want to take more of that ad hoc approach. I do think that organizations and companies have an opportunity to pilot different creative programs and then share that piloting with folks as a way to say like, hey, this is how we've navigated the current legal landscape. But so those are the two thoughts that were coming to mind for me. Aparna, what would you add?
I'll say really quickly, we've noticed, Chaz, that there are more sort of groups of people coming together to engage in those systemic responses. So GARE is a government, government something for racial equity, Government Association for Racial Equity or something. It's a whole bunch of government employees across the country who are coming together, not only to sort of like figure out individual solutions, but to figure out like as a group of folks working across government, can they actually do something more systemic? And I think there's similar stuff happening. But you're right that right now it's been, you know, like this recent backlash, it's been just a year into it. A lot of the responses are happening in this like way, but things are shifting and changing, and there are more people coming together around collective responses, which is exciting.
Cool. Okay, so there's a couple more questions in Q&A, and then I think there's one more in the chat too. So another person asks, what are some calling and approaches you have seen that are successful in creating change and demonstrate to the org that the conversations are taking place even when they may not be public, and not being ignored? Aparna, you want to take the first go at this one?
Yeah, I think that that's a great question, because I think a lot of times we assume that if this calling in isn't happening in public, that the person is not being held accountable, or the people in groups. I do think like one-on-one conversations are always, I think, the most successful relationship building and having those one-on-one conversations. And if you're not that, you feel like you're not the right person to have that difficult conversation for change, finding kind of the champions and allies who have more power in your company and organization, or other, like if you're in a small company and you notice the CEO of another is really bought in, like asking them to have a conversation with your leader. So I think the short of it is like conversations and relationship building is what we've seen is most successful at creating change, short of like policy changes.
Yeah, I will just say I just designed a very quick sort of conversation about this, and like when it comes to calling folks in, the tactics that I keep coming back to are like deeply listening and being very curious about where that person is coming from before you react or share your own perspective. Then share the impact of what they've done once you understand what they meant, all of that stuff. And then also sharing your own learning and giving them that permission structure to change their mind. So those are kind of the three components that I think of. Okay, I think we have time for this last one. We need to wrap up in a minute. But someone asked, I like some of the suggested language, such as fairness and belonging. They are specific and easy to understand. In the context of backlashes, do you recommend that companies adjust public-facing messages away from DEI to avoid controversy? I'll really quickly say I would use the language to make it more accessible to a broader community of people. I would not necessarily think about it as avoiding controversy. Aparna, what do you want to add?
Yeah, I'm not saying that folks should avoid the word DEI in public facing messaging. Especially as I said, like in some of our states, like it's not really even an issue. Like, you know, we're continuing to do DEI work in Oregon. I do think that it's helpful when you're talking about specific strategies that you're all engaging in, to just be very precise in what those strategies are about versus just calling all of them like DEI work. You know what I mean? So that's what I would say. We're not recommending people avoid using DEI.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Aparna and Ava. We truly appreciate your expertise. This was an incredible webinar. And we're really excited to have you back in November. So if you are on this webinar and want to continue this conversation, we will have another one. Make sure you're signed up for People for Bikes emails to be getting those. And if you have any questions, we will be sending out the recording as well as the deck, and as some additional notes to all of the attendees, everybody who registered, And we truly appreciate everyone for joining us. Thank you so much. Have a great day and have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, everyone.